Distant future Nicolas here! I'm sorry I'm late! It's taken me like 5 months to edit this episode. So if anything refers to something happening around now, it's about 5 months into now. It's fine, you'll live. Also, someone has drawn us an official logo for the podcast. He's written me how to pronounce his name in a way that any proper American would understand. Unfortunately, I'm French, so his name is Jason Sosted, I don't know. You'll find it written in the description. You know him on BGG as Yellow Shoes. He's the guy who shits on your favorite games in the BoardGameGeek comment section with lots of alliterations. But he's really funny. Anyway, distant future Nicolas out. Beep, 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 beep.
My face is delicious.
Cube roots, cube roots, cube roots, cube roots.
Welcome to episode 2 of Cube Roots, a podcast about old-school German-style board games, also known as OGs. I'm your regular host, Nicolas Weiss, and my favorite Cube Root is the Cube Root of 27. Joining me today, our second Brit on the show, it's Andy Pymont.
Hi Nicholas, great to join you today.
Also with me today, our first non-flying Dutchman on the show, Dennis Slowman.
Great pronunciation, Nicholas. Thank you.
After some feedback, we're trying a shorter format today. I have to admit that up to now, I wanted to try notably the fan mail to be a thing. So I push people to ask questions. And from now on, if you want to ask questions, just geek mail me at Nicolas Weiss on BoardGameGeek. And if no more happen, then we'll just postpone the segment indefinitely. Also, we don't have any specialist of the news today, so we'll mostly stay on topic of the day and maybe diverge a bit afterwards. But we're trying to stay within an hour this time. You can probably see by the timestamp that we already failed, but it's fine. We're trying our best anyway.
We haven't failed yet.
We haven't.
But we will. I know we will.
So let's jump immediately to the topic of the day.
It's a topic of the day.
Today for the topic of the day, I chose something a bit lighter because I have the funny boys with me. The topic of the day is your 3 favorite things about OG games. So, like for the pilot episode, what we're going to do is each of us has come with 3 different items and that we have not shared with each other, so there might be some crossover, and we're just going to do a non-ordered or ordered top 3. In my case, it's not ordered.
My list also isn't ordered, but yes, I would be very surprised if we don't have at least some overlap in our list.
Yeah.
Since this is a board game podcast, I'm going to roll the die to see who's the starting player. The starting player is Andy. We'll go in this order: Andy, then Dennis, then me.
Okay, so one of my favourite features about old school German style games that differentiates them particularly from a lot of new releases, and particularly the things you might see near the top of the BoardGameGeek rankings, is rules complexity, or rather a lack of rules complexity. So for me, one of the great things about games that were popular in the 90s in particular, and games that are made in that style, is that generally they have fewer rules, perhaps a more simple system with fewer exceptions, maybe are focused on 1 or 2 elements instead of being a complex combination of systems or mechanisms. I think this brings a lot of stuff to the table. Obviously, it makes the games much more suited to playing in a family environment, but personally, I also think it's great if you're playing even with other gamers, because it makes the whole element of teaching people the rules much more straightforward and out of the way earlier on, because you've got less information to convey before you can all start playing.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So is it mostly about the rules overhead for you or the teaching overhead for you?
So I think both of those things are important. The more time I spend in the hobby, the more I come to think about the knowledge transfer and teach element of it, because particularly if you're playing a new game very often, communicating the rules of that game can take a lot of time. And even though games do have a lot of similar mechanisms, and it's very rare you play a game that everything's completely new to you, onboarding people is always a big element of getting people started with the game. So I think as I go on more and more, I appreciate more the teach element of it. But there is also the rules complexity as well, because I think the fewer rules there are, the easier it is for everyone to have the rules in their head. And the other element that I know we've talked about on the forums as well on BoardGameGeek is that if you know all of the rules, you can get past those rules, and you're much more focused then on playing the game well against the other players, rather than making a mistake because you didn't understand the rules, and then that can be very frustrating for everyone and lead to a situation where, what's the best way to proceed? Should we undo that, but maybe new information was revealed, etc., etc. So I just think both of those elements are important. The knowledge transfer at the start, but also if you've got less complexity, it's more likely that everyone at the table, so people who've played a lot and people who haven't played a lot, have got the core rules in their mind, and therefore we're able much more to be focused on how are we competing with each other, rather than have I understood all of the rules.
It's interesting because do you think that the onboarding process is a problem in the current hobby that is making so much money? It visibly doesn't have a lot of problems onboarding players. Is it a different demographic?
I think I like to learn a game best at a table from someone who knows the game well. Now, obviously, it's difficult if you're playing a brand new game, because is there anyone who knows the game well in order to do that effective communication and teaching? Nowadays, I think there's a trend for people to use YouTube videos and things like that with some of the newer games on the market. And I can understand why that's popular, because someone will have done a lot of work for you to prepare that teach to communicate the information. So I think if I'm going to play a very complex game, setting an expectation on the players that they have used that sort of material, or particularly, I know when I played some very big, complicated war games, like Here I Stand, and there's just 6 of you, you're going to be there all day, so everyone spending a few hours beforehand making sure they're prepared is a worthwhile investment. But I think one of the things I like about an OG is you can just get it out on the table, and because there usually is that simplicity as compared to some more complicated games you can play, it's easier to get everyone up and running, even if they haven't sort of done their homework, if you like.
Right. Now that you tell me, I remember that there used to be a time where I had this informal etiquette where if you asked me to bring a game, you asked me 3 or 4 days in advance so that I have time to prepare the rules on my free time, which used to be a bit of a bother, right? I can't just open a box, quickly refresh myself and whatnot. Because a lot of people I play with are not hobbyists. They are not going to read the rules by themselves.
Or even watch a video, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And even then, it's interesting now that we resort to YouTube to teach rules, because it removes an extra layer of socialization, because people are not there for the teach anymore. You don't have the teach as some sort of communal activity, which I never realized until you pointed it out.
Yes, and I think that goes back as well to what I mentioned before about when I think about OG games, I think of them as starting a tradition of a family game. And obviously in a family environment, it's not likely I would say to my nephew, like, go and read a rule book before I play with you.
Go and watch this 3-hour YouTube video.
Yeah, exactly. It's more, here's this game we're going to play and I'll teach you to play it. So I like that sort of social, like almost oral tradition of it. But that's hard to achieve with a very complicated game. So the simpler the game is, the more you can be in this dynamic. And I think I just have different expectations for a more complicated game. And what I like about OGs is that I can get away from that a bit, and it's a bit, it's a bit easier to get everyone up and running.
Have you ever seen like groups, because I've read about this on BGG, like some groups, they like actually put a laptop on the table and then watch a YouTube video together. I just love the visual of that, right? So everybody's coming.
Yeah.
I have to admit, right, it's something that I've almost done, but I've come to the conclusion that some professionals who put up a video and spent like dozens of hours preparing it will be more efficient at teaching the rules than me. So I'm super, super tempted to go through their 20-minute rule explanation rather than my 40-minute one.
Well, the difference, of course, is that the professional will teach you all the rules, and that's a topic in and of itself, right? But I usually prefer just to teach most of the rules, or just a gist, right? So people can get started and just get to playing fast, right? And that's what I usually love the best, if you can just play a lot, right? So I don't even mind teaches, and I don't even mind rules or rules complexity, but I just love getting to a table and start playing, right? So that's...
Yeah. And the problem I've had is I've had crowd of people who go, teach us the basics and we'll pick it up while we play, and then get frustrated because they get shafted by one of the rules that they didn't know or didn't understand correctly.
Yeah, so that is obviously an advantage of, again, a simpler system and a simpler rules to a game, is that there's likely a bit less of that. There's less of the upfront. There's probably fewer exceptions that you have to cover, so it's a bit less likely that someone's going to be surprised by something like that during play. I think on what you've said, Nicholas, about being tempted to show the video, I can understand that because I know when I'm teaching, I have quite a high standard that I'd like to set on myself in terms of what I'm delivering for other players, much like I'd like to receive from other people. I'm a bit more gracious with other people, but when I'm delivering a teach, I think I want to do a good job here of communicating the information. So again, the easier that is, the better.
Yeah.
If it's a very complicated game, if I know it very well, obviously I can still do a good job of that. But if I've just bought a game, it's brand new or something like that, if it's a OG style game, it's a bit quicker for me to get to the point where I'm comfortable teaching it as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree. As someone who's taught for a living, I have the bias of wanting to teach all the rules, and complicated games are my bane for that. It's not necessarily that I care about people playing well or even myself playing well, but I just have the mindset of wanting to know the rules beforehand, purely by habit, and this suits me better personally on top of all the qualities you have expressed.
Is this the part where we make fun of you that you never teach the rules right, Nicholas?
It's not never, but we can wait for it. I'll have a segue about that incident.
Good, we'll save it. Yeah, so my next pick is also related to your pick, Andy, and it's not rule simplicity, but it's accessibility, right? There's a difference there to me because you've spoken about learning the rules and teaching the rules, and I don't even mind that much, right? Because I kind of like reading rule books and technical documents, and just give me a GMT rule book, and I'll just I love it.
Yeah, like these people who buy like role-playing game supplements just to read them and never to use any of the material in their games.
I have a friend who does that, and then every time we get together to play board games, he just tells me about all these RPG books, right? And I'm like, he never plays them, right? And he's just buying
I think
books.
that is something.
Yeah.
That is something that exists in the sort of role playing and a bit in the war game tradition, like where you mentioned GMT rulebook. There is an element of being able to experience the rulebook as sort of an artifact in and of itself.
And I know that Bruno Faiduti has written sometimes he used to buy games just to read the rulebooks in a time where there were not PDFs readily available online. Maybe that it nurtures his design spirit or something.
No, but there's also like a joy in it, looking forward to something, right? Because I'm reading the rules, I'm seeing a rule, and I get excited. Like I'm like, ooh, this sounds good. This is just up my alley, right? So it's an interesting thing. I mean, I can totally imagine people not liking that, but that's something I really enjoy. And especially, as you said, Andy, with the big war games, right? It's even more interesting because you start reading the rule book, setting up the game, moving some pieces around and seeing how it works. I find systems interesting, right? And so I love fiddling around with systems and reading about systems. So that's interesting to me. But I diverted a bit from our topic, but let's get back to the core, right? So accessibility, and what I love about it is, and it's something you hinted at as well, right, is that you can play OGs with a lot of different people, right? And so of course there are the simpler card game like the Nimmt that you can play with almost anybody, but even like the somewhat more complicated, somewhat more involved games, I think they offer a great balance between gamer games, so to speak, right? And it's always a term I'm like, I don't know how to call these things, right? But between a gamer game and something that casual audiences can enjoy and just get to the table together, right? And enjoy this thing together, even though it's, trying to speak to potentially different audiences at the table. And that's what I love a lot about it. And of course, to teach is a part of that, because of normal folks, let's just call them that, like normal folks don't enjoy being taught a game, right? I mean, I don't think anybody enjoys it, and everybody just wants to get playing and get started. And that's what I love the most personally, just getting to play games with lots of different people from all different walks of life and just enjoying something together.
Yeah, of course by normal folks we're referring to
everybody besides us.
Yes. Oh, that's very like, I know that you've called them muggles in the past.
Yes.
Which, oh boy. Yeah, but basically anyone who doesn't identify as a hobbyist, I'd say. Which is 99.99% of people when it comes to board games.
Yeah, no, exactly. And even then, I've taught some pretty complicated games to people. And it's interesting because usually when people see board games and they're like fascinated by a theme or something, right, the hurdle to learning the rules and needing to learn the rules isn't as big. And you can teach pretty involved games. But for the most part, right, I think it just works best to pick something that
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying, Dennis. This is slightly different than just about the rules complexity, because this is allowing you to share the joy of these old school German games with other people, and that's a great aspect that they have, is that they're more shareable in that regard because of this greater level of accessibility, and also comes with perhaps more similarities to some traditional games. So where you mentioned some of these card games, a lot of them are riffing off of traditional card games in a way that gives people more of an on-ramp than they might otherwise have.
Yeah, exactly. And so Trick Takers is, of course, a great example for that. Someone going further than just the OG style games, right? But just Trick Takers are great for that, because at work, I play a lot of Trick Takers, and it's with an audience of people that don't play games usually, right? But they play card games, right? So they would never call themselves a gamer or whatever, right? But they've played these traditional card games. They've played a couple of the modern ones, and I just bring Trick Takers along every now and then, and we play a lot. And the fun thing, especially if you get a group going with Trick Takers specifically, and a couple of other genres of board game have this as well. But with Trick Takers, right, it's just a couple of words, right, are enough to explain the rules for most of them, right? It's just, okay, must follow, may trump, etc., right? And that's even more joyous, I think, too, because you can get started in like a minute. It's fantastic.
Yeah, there's a lot of accessibility baked in the genre, because this is probably the first time I'm saying it on the podcast, but this is an opinion that I have regularly on the forums, which is secretly trick-taking games are part of the OG, but since they have their own guild on BGG, we're trying to be diplomatic and leave them having their own space with their own subgenre, and not try to grab a space that they've had for a long time with their own forum for a while. But I feel like OGs, if not including trick-taking, are spiritual descendants of traditional games anyway, which have a very easy onboarding process and a lot of vocabulary that is understood by everyone. Like, if I was an alien and came to Earth, the concept, for example, that
this explains a lot, Nicholas. It's Nicholas's origin story finally coming to light.
Yeah, what was the word "if" doing in that sentence? Did you
So
mean to
when
say
I came when I initially came to Earth, right, the concept that a hand was private information, or what a hand of cards was, how you hand it, what rolling a die means, what you do after you rolled it. Oh, you're supposed to read the face that's standing up, right? It's a lot of things that are not intuitive, but that you're taught very early in life, at least in our cultures where we have access to dice and cards and whatnot very early. And for an amount of hobbyists, there are other concepts like worker placement and whatnot that is also second nature to them.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to teach a game to normies, you will rely actually on knowledge that they already have. They're not a blank slate. And it's because they already have some grammar of games that they ignore they have because they think they're completely inept, but they're not. Because at a young age, they were taught common grammar of games, and we just build on that layer rather than other layers that only innate circles of Dorkness have access to.
That's a new name for the podcast. Innate circles of Dorkness.
I meant inner circles, but I can't language. Like, Andy has natural advantage here because he's
I
young
do,
and
yeah.
native speaker.
I'm in
He's
awe
cheating again.
because I couldn't do this in any other language. So yeah, I think for me as well, it's also the way you interact with the game. In an OG game can sometimes be simpler. So I think this gets into this accessibility. So obviously, like you said, a trick taker, it's very obvious there's a structure to it that everyone already knows. But even in other OG games, there's a very simple to convey structure. Like if I think of something like Ink and Gold, it's very easy to teach people because you literally have two options. Are you going to continue or are you going to leave? And obviously in that case it also connects very successfully to the setting, but a very simple framework to explain to people. And I think that even extends then from Ink and Gold into something like Ra, because again on your turn you do one thing and it's from a very limited set of options. So again that gives that accessibility to someone compared to different genres of games where maybe there's literally 30 different things you could do this turn.
Are we invoking Odin here rather than Ra?
Yes, so the difference between invoking Ra and invoking Odin, I think, is quite significant, yes.
But something related to that, right? So Ra is a great example because the great thing about Ra is that all information is public. And that's such a small thing, but I've noticed this with playing with children, right? Is that because of all the public information, it's really easy to help players next to you, right? And that's also something I've learned from playing games with children, right? If all information is public, it's really easy to share, right? If there's no burden on someone hiding information from the rest of the players, it makes the game way more accessible.
Yeah, and speaking of that, so I don't have a lot of, well, I actually have a lot of thoughts on accessibility, which could be some episode, but I can't synthesize them here very well. I see accessibility as a rainbow umbrella term of a lot of things, which Andy referred to as the onboarding process, right? For me, a game is accessible if you remove all the problems that the game has that would make someone who would like the game not play it. So it can be rules, it can be price, it can be sensitivity of the setting, it can be a lot of things. And I picked one setting of accessibility as my first pick because I was like, why do I like OGs? If I go by our guild definition, which is just, they're simple, they have player interaction, blah, blah, we just have the same list, all three.
Yeah.
So very personal pick for the first one. I like OGs a lot because of language independence.
Yes.
And that is something that is very important to me and maybe to Dennis, who has to import games all the time, because I'm actually playing now in 2, sometimes a 3rd different countries with people who speak 2 languages, whom we maybe communicate with each other only in English, which is neither's mother tongue.
Yeah.
And language independence is absolutely a boon. And it also helps when I'm playing with my family, with children, that there is especially no text on components or very little of it. Or I think that language dependence is a spectrum. It's not you have language dependence or you do not. And I think BGG having a scale for this is pretty on point. For me, there are 3 broad stages. There is no language required to put on the components, no text whatsoever. Second layer, there is text, but it is simple and or all the text is on public information so that whoever teaches the game can explain live what this means. And the third player is essentially you have cards in hand with text on them and you don't want to reveal what your hand is, but you also don't understand exactly what this does. And this is a mess. And I think that OGs are characterized by being more often than not in the first group. I say more often than not because our attempts to define OG have come to the conclusion that there is no characteristic that every OG does. It's more like, do you have an amount of typical characteristics? But typically, OGs have simple components, and especially components with no text on them.
It's a family resemblance, right? So if you have enough of the properties, you'll look like an OG in this case. So I agree with you. And what I think's interesting, Nicholas, about this is that when the games first really took off in the 1990s, sort of the early Euro games that now are a bit different to a modern Euro, but we think of a lot of them as OGs, those games, a lot of them were in German. So this is what allowed them to become popular in the English-speaking world, is that they were very easy for someone to bring into an English environment. You know, we had fans getting translations of the rules and things on the news groups before BoardGameGeek existed, and this is a big element of something like Settlers of Catan, is that it was relatively easy compared to some games to convert that from German into English. And it's great you bring this up because probably for people like myself who, you know, English is a first language, we don't really think of this today because we have an enormous privilege that almost all games now are being produced in English, and this isn't really as big an element. But actually going back to the 1990s, this is part of what allowed some of those early Euros to be a big hit in the English-speaking world, is that they were very easy to translate because you only needed probably a page of rules and the game didn't need any language to play it.
Yeah, it's funny because nowadays on like content creators, influencers, whatever we want to call them, right, on YouTube, you often see the opposite complaint, right, is that nowadays because games are getting more complex, language independence is still a virtue, I think, for a lot of games. Content creators on YouTube are complaining about the fact that games are making these really complicated iconographies just to stay language independent. And they say, just put text on it, right? But then text creates a different problem, right? Because it's more precise, but it's less accessible in a way, right? So that's an interesting dichotomy there where the market has shifted so much that it seems to have become a downside in some cases.
Yeah, and even if the iconography itself turns out to be a good idea, which I hear from fans of Race for the Galaxy.
Is this where we tell you that Race for the Galaxy is way less complicated than you think it is, Nicholas? Or
No. Even if the iconography seems to be warranted, or people who have played Race for the Galaxy more times than I have will tell me that, you can see that it still has the reputation of having an overcomplicated iconography because it looks imposing and it relates to the onboarding process. If you're a first-timer, see that iconography, it's about the same or even worse than getting a lot of text, because what the iconography is essentially doing is trying to represent words. And it's just a sneaky way of doing words of cards that is language independent, but still a lot of words on cards.
Yeah, functionally, the first time you play Race to the Galaxy, it will fit into your third category, which is that you've got a hand of cards that's private information to you that has a language you can't understand written on it. You can have a player aid that helps you through that, but really that iconography is a barrier that you get through by repeated play. And Race to the Galaxy is a game that really rewards repeated play, so a lot of us like it. But obviously, it's very not OG in that respect because it's not easy and accessible to understand what that means on play one.
Yeah, it's just a game that's language dependent. It just made its own hieroglyphical language.
Well, there is a lot of language on the cards, to be fair.
Oh, also, but I have played with a basic set only, so there were not a lot of cards with a lot of text.
Its reputation is definitely exaggerated compared to a lot of modern Euros now, but at the same time, it's a good example of what Dennis is talking about, these content creators saying that now every game has got that, whereas I think when it was first said, and people still associate it with Race to the Galaxy, oh, that's the game with the complicated icons, but actually now there's quite a lot of games that have got those complicated icons, and probably a lot of them are not as well thought out as the Race to the Galaxy system of icons as well.
Yeah, and to be fair, Race for the Galaxy's iconography is pretty simple for the most part. I mean, I wouldn't, again, talking about accessibility, I wouldn't put it in front of like new gamers, but it's very approachable for the most part. But there are like a handful of little exceptions and little icons they had to add because they just couldn't think of anything, right? And those are just, I think they're pretty bad, but I think most of it is great.
Yeah, but the point is, this is not at ground level for accessibility.
No.
And nowadays, there are a lot of games that are orders of magnitude worse.
Yeah.
Yes. It's combining sort of all of our first points. I think it's a great example because if you were going to teach Race to the Galaxy and you had never played it before and no one you were playing with had never played it before, I think that'd be quite a difficult experience.
It has been.
Whereas having played Race to the Galaxy a lot, I know certain things. So Dennis says there, oh, there's some things that are a bit strange you need to explain. I know when I teach someone completely new, I need to cover the contact specialist card specifically because it's an exception to a lot of rules. And again, that's the thing that a sort of German-style family board game I think of from the 90s doesn't tend to have that, where there are 100 different cards and there's 2 or 3 of them that I'm going to have to find in the deck during a rules explanation and tell you, look out for this one, it does this.
Yeah.
We have done a big onboarding fest for our first
yes,
item.
We have.
I like it. Have you ever tried teaching a trick taker to someone who's never played a trick taker?
Yes.
It's quite hard.
It's very
That's the
hard.
amount of things we take for granted. So teaching games is hard and should be made easy for people who don't identify as gamers.
I think for me, it's about making it easy for everyone, even if you are a gamer, and even if you're the person teaching it. So that's the thing. It's like, how easy can we make it for everyone? Because what I like is playing games. I don't particularly like learning games. Sometimes it's interesting, like Dennis says, a new system, but compared to playing, it's not as interesting.
Yeah, but of course the point is you want to do that by yourself, right? It's no fun learning a game in a group, right? There's no fun in that. The fun is playing.
I mean, someone sat reading from the rulebook to everyone. I mean,
I've had that experience a few weeks ago.
Oh boy.
Someone came to a board game night and she said, okay, I got this new game, and she was very excited about it. She just got it in today, and she said, I read the rules. Mostly, it's not that difficult. And so we needed like 45 minutes to get started, right? Because like reading a rule book with people around you, because I was like, you set it up, I'll flip through the rules as well, right? Just to make sure we have 2 people who've read the rules. And I was trying to read the rules, and the game wasn't that complicated, right? But I was reading the rules and I was like, oh, all these people around me, just shut up. I'm trying to read rules here. But it was quite...
Yeah, and the pressure as well, because then you feel under the social pressure. You're delaying everyone else's experience of playing, and that's not a good place for them or for you to be in. Yeah.
We should have Darryl on the podcast back just to explain us how do people learn games in pubs or board game cafes. That's a strange concept to me. Maybe I'm just getting old and can't, with all the noise, concentrate on the rulebook anymore.
But that's why I think if you, in that environment, running that environment, an OG game is a great part of your library for that sort of environment, because it is going to be much easier for people to pick up.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what Daryl's situation is, but I've been to like board game cafes. For example, in Copenhagen, there's an awesome board game cafe called the Bosch Cafe. They just have people walking around there who just know tons and tons of rules, and they just teach them all day, right? So they serve some drinks, teach some rules, bring some food, right? So it's a crazy situation there. But I'm not assuming that Daryl makes all his waiters learn all the rules for all the games in the in his restaurant.
He certainly does. Well, learn the rules himself.
Yes.
Oh,
He
yes.
definitely does. He definitely does.
Shall we rotate the start player?
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you want to handle the order for the second round?
Dennis goes first, then me, then Andy.
Okay, great.
All right. So my second thing I like about OGs is very, very predictable, and it's top of the list item for a lot of people in the guild, I guess, which is interaction. So OGs, mostly for me, like accessibility is a thing I really appreciate in them, but I had to think hard about that one, right? Because when Nicholas asked me the question, like, what do you like about OGs? I was like, yeah, interaction. Done. That's it, right?
Yeah, but that's what you like about heavier games too, right?
Yes, exactly. I just like having no interaction just bores me to shreds. It's even if it's just a little bit, or if it's just social interaction somewhat at the table, right? And even like something like Race for the Galaxy, right? It's not the most directly interactive game. It's not kicking each other or hitting each other in the face or something, right? But everything you do, you have to judge what the other players will be doing, and that's one of the most annoying things about a lot of these more multiplayer solitaire modern Euros. Is I play a lot of games on gut feeling, right? I just take my move, take 10-15 seconds, and of course sometimes I think a bit too long, just like anyone else does. But I just take a couple of seconds and then I just wait for 5 minutes until it's my turn again, and nothing has happened that has influenced my turn, right? And it's just that's the most boring thing to me. It's just I hate it so much. I just hate it so much waiting on my turn.
That said, does player interaction actually help with that? My understanding is player interaction increases the chances that you have to care about what happened during other players' turn. So you can't plan your turn in advance, which means that when your turn comes, if you're Dennis Lauman, you can take your turn in 15 seconds, but other players have maybe to play more tactically and more reactively, so it might make the experience longer with OGs.
I haven't experienced them as such, and it might be because pressure that more strategic games, so to say, bring is that you need to make sure your turn is perfect, right? And with more tactical games, a lot more people are comfortable with just taking their turn and going. And the thing, of course, just to expand upon your point, right, it doesn't make the waiting less, potentially, right? People can still just AP and take massive amounts of time on the turn. But the thing is, what they do impacts me. And the fact that it impacts me also creates a way more social dynamic at the table, right? And so I love games where people start bantering with each other or cajoling each other into taking risks or just complaining about other people or anything to do with communication and the social experience. And I think interaction brings that out in most games.
Yeah, because you're invested in other players' turns, so you're always playing on some level.
Yeah, I think often you'll see it discussed online, particularly if someone says this game is not interactive. And if that is your favourite game, even if it's low interaction, you see some people can take that quite personally and say, no, it is very interactive. I played this 100 times with a partner and I'm really engaged on what they're doing on there. But I think the level of familiarity they have has allowed them to reach a point where they're much more engaged with what other players are doing. Because, Dennis, where you sort of say a game where you've got to puzzle out your own turn and be efficient, for a lot of us, like the whole time it's not your turn, you might be having to solve that puzzle in order to make an effective move. And then once you're very familiar with the game, you don't have to do that. These are heads-up experience, and you're able to interact more with the other players. But I think the advantage of OGs is that they're much more generally heads-up to begin with. So you don't have to have got to that stage where, the game's so well that you're not solving your player board puzzle and you're able to see the other players. You have a much more shared focus right from play one. Games that encourage you to be involved in other people's turns, or you're all interacting in one area, everyone's engaged straight away. I think sometimes when you say to people that game is not interactive, they'll say, well, actually, there's loads of this subtle interaction. But what we're talking about here is that the game doesn't have to be subtle, because some of these OG games are very in-your-face interaction, and you can't miss it at all. Yeah,
if you only play 25 times, you will see it's interactive.
but I think it's also like the word interaction that started to mean something else, right? Where interaction isn't I do something and it accidentally influences your turn or your choices, right? That's not interacting with somebody. That's just,
Yeah, I mean, to mock people a bit, we've come to a point where you might say, I forgot to put deodorant this morning and your turn is worse because of that. And that counts as player interaction to them.
So we're talking there about what isn't interactive, these sort of games where there's no involvement with the other players. What is it you think that you're really highlighting here with OGs, Dennis? Is it that we're all involved in one space on the central board, or is it something else? Because I know
Yeah.
sometimes we talk about shared space.
Oh, burying the lead here.
Yeah, no, I love shared space games, and I also love shared incentives. I like a lot of train games as well, right, where shared incentives is almost like built into almost every train game out there. And I just love the the cynical way of explaining this would be I love manipulating people. But I just
Yeah,
like
but no, we love manipulating each other for mutual benefit.
Exactly. That is interesting because then you're like playing the players, right? That makes it a way more social experience, a way more fun experience in my book. And it doesn't have to be a negotiation game or whatever, right? But if a game offers some space, even if a group doesn't take it, but if a game offers some space for negotiation, I think the game is doing a good thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing that OGs will do more than more wargamey genres because violent themes and destructive themes are less prominent. Because OGs started as a family-friendly genre, you will have types of interaction that are more semi-cooperative and more conducive to the type of experience that you like.
And the thing I wanted to add earlier, right? It's also interesting in that a lot of modern trends with regards to interaction, like lowering it, probably also like increases accessibility for a lot of people, right? Because a lot of people do not like interaction and do not want to be punched in the face. And so a lot of these more solitaire-ish games and puzzly games open up the board game hobby to a lot of new people.
That's a good thing. If you think that the type of interactions that OG have are often semi-cooperative, and that you know that a lot of people that you like are onboarded onto the hobby by cooperative games because this is stress removed. I am not fighting you. I am not responsible alone for my victory or defeat. We are working together on something. And if you can export some of that feeling because you want to play a game maybe that is not as bossy as many cooperative games can be, but when you can occasionally hold hands together against the common enemy, Mark or Martin or whoever, we can have a beneficial arrangement without having to have outright diplomacy-like negotiations that are very heavy and require a lot of planning, a lot of emotional investment, and you just likely make a move that says, hey, if you help me here. Okay, so my second item will be relatively short because it's a crossover.
Yay! Woo!
Yeah, it's rules. I like rules in OG games. Let's give miscredit where miscredit is due. The rulebooks of OG games used to be absolute garbage in the 90s and the early 2000s.
Especially translations.
Especially translations, and especially when you misread translations of, say, Bridges to Shangri-La after not having played it for years and thinking you mastered the rulebook. But that's to their credit, right? I completely botched the teaching of that game, but that's an indictment how usually I would manage to remember games years after not playing them if they're OGs. It lured me into a sense of overconfidence, but because by experience I knew that OGs were easy to teach. Their rules are super streamlined, they are super easy to reread. I'm one of these weirdos who sometimes I don't have a good book to read and I want to read something before falling asleep, and then I just realized that I thought I would read one rule book before falling asleep, and then in 20 minutes I've skimmed over 4 of them, and that's how easy they are to relearn. You can just reteach them to a new audience very easily, and that's super fine. I don't have a lot of things to say. I'm stretching for time here to have something to say, but unfortunately, Andy has been very exhaustive on the topic previously.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is a good element. It makes it a bit easier to pull it off the shelf after you've been away from it. And like you say, you may only need 1 detail or 2 details, like, you know, how many coins do I start with? Or, you know, how many cards do I begin with in hand? And then you're off and running.
Sorry, I just love the visual of Nicolas falling asleep with rule books on his face.
With 4 rule books lying all over
Yeah,
him
like
while he's in bed, yeah.
Rulebook on my forehead, cat on my belly, the usual.
He's all right though because they're OG rulebooks, so they're only 1 or 2, you know, sheets. They're not. It's,
Yeah,
it's not a
exactly.
textbook. He's not fallen asleep with the D&D monster manual.
Yeah, but speaking of Dennis getting excited about games, right? I get the same amount of excitement from a 2-page rulebook from a thing I have not played in years, but just to hype me again. Was this game that good? And then I just skim over the rules. I'm like, oh yeah, that was awesome. I remember what this implies, and that was very good. And I get that in a fraction of a second, well, a fraction of a minute, I guess.
So my second item is a bit of overlap with Dennis's item there as well, but I'm going to add a little bit of a spin to it. I think a great thing with OG is where we have a shared space where we're all interacting on one central board usually, although it could be made up of, what we've played or the tiles that we've collected in Ra, for example. But if we've got a central board in a game like, for example, Can't Stop, and we can all see our progress in the game in one central area, the thing I really like about everyone's focus being on that board is the way that with everyone focused there, we really start to experience other players' personalities because we're all interacting with each other and everything we do affects other players, as Dennis covered before. I think that's what really allows different individuals' take on things to come through. It's not just that we're sat here playing our efficiency card tableau and the one of us who does it the best wins the game with the highest score. Instead, it's I do things because I'm a very risky player, or a bit like Dennis said before, I think I play similarly to how you described, where I'm much more of an intuitive player than a calculational one. I sort of think, what if I auction that shop there in Marrakesh? I think that might affect this. And I think you really start to get a feel for how someone will play, so a bit like if you were playing a game like chess with someone and they had a certain opening that they like, you can see the same thing, I think, in OG games. And again, it might be there in a sort of modern Euro, but you wouldn't experience it as much because it isn't in the shared space. So what I like about the shared space is that other players' personality affects the game and affects you. So therefore, you feel much more like you're playing with that person rather than we're just sat at the same table together and the game is happening to both of us.
I think what's interesting there is especially the social space, right? Because Can't Stop in and of itself, like the game itself doesn't revolve around a common space, right? It's not really a game about a common space. The common space is created between the players, rolling dice and
Yeah, the board doesn't really do it so much as the sum of how risk averse or risky people have been, and the way, if someone really does push it early on and they get lucky, that has a profound effect on me and changes how I have to play the game. And if I play the same game again with my cousin or something, and every time I know they're just going to push it that one time too many, and a bit like you said, there's about adding an element of negotiation, I can then play on that a bit and think, I'll just egg them on here to roll the die one more time and see what happens. Then you really feel like you're playing with that person and not just, sat at the table.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, so ever since the thread on the guild, and it was a few weeks ago, I think, where somebody said, oh, you can make Can't Stop into a roll and write. I've been thinking about, what's it called again, the Nogmaal, the Incas and Marcus Brand roll and write. Is it Encore in English, I think? And it has a somewhat similar mechanic in that once you complete a column or something, I don't remember the exact details, you basically say, okay, I completed this column, and then nobody can complete that column anymore, right? That's kind of the interaction that Can't Stop has, right? I completed this column. Nobody else can complete this column anymore, right? And I'm wondering whether changing the components of Can't Stop would make it into a more heads-down experience, or if it's core to the game, to the way the dice work and the... Yeah, Nicholas?
Oh, you could have finished your sentence.
Sorry, I was distracted.
Andy has spoken a couple times about Ra this episode, probably because he's been recently pressed by the game after making a fairly cool module for virtualtabletop.io, which I think is a component upgrade over physical Ra, in that it puts all the scoring areas of players together, which is about the same comparison that you're talking about between having Can't Stop on your own sheets and Can't Stop of a common sheet. And suddenly, when you group people's stuff together, a game's interaction shines more, which is something that also happens in one of our OGs of the month, which I've forgotten the game of, Tourne and Taxes, right? Where essentially what you have is, at 4 players, 4 personal player boards overlapping with each other. And
I think if that game was published today, it's possible it would be player boards instead of a central board. Or at least it could be. Another game that's had this done with it is Puerto Rico. There's a fan redesign on BoardGameGeek, which puts everything in the central area. So rather than there being 2 copies of the factory that, 2 people can buy during the game, 2 people can put an ownership marker on a factory during the game. I've not played it that way, but I wonder if playing it on that redesign would change the way some people felt about the interaction in the game, because again it would just lay things out differently. It's an interesting question. I don't know if Can't Stop would fundamentally change for me. I think you need to know if someone's about to cross a column off, and I'd have to look at their sheet.
Yeah, and the Puerto Rico example, right? Just the physical act of putting a cube onto something in between the players just changes the dynamic at the table, I think.
I mean, obviously I've never seen it apart from as a digital file, but I would be very interested to play the game.
What I will say say is that my own copy of Ra, with its little printed from BGG player aids to help people for scoring, frustrates me now that I've played the online version. And I want a version of Ra where we all have really clear depiction of who's gunning for what and how can we stop them gathering more of these types of monument or finishing an entire thing. Because when you have players having their scoring areas, which are not that complex but had an amount of stuff going on in Ra in 4 different corners of a table, and you have to matter about them, you have a reduced problem of what I call the Isle of Skye issue, which is that Isle of Skye is a great game and would be a game that I would still have in my collection if I could be asked passing everyone else's island to know how they value things. And it's just a bit too far and a bit too complex.
It would be much more interactive if you could set, because it's a price setting game, isn't it? If you could easily see what other people have, it's going to make setting the prices easier. I think the brand new version of Ra that some people have just got, that's just been published, is it by 25th Century, that looks like it's an improvement in that everyone's player area will be laid out the same. So at least that'll make it a bit easier. And then maybe if you played where you all push that as close to the centre of the table as you could, Nicholas, that would give you more of the feeling of, oh, I can really easily see who's got 3 pharaohs, who's got 2, who's got 2 of that monument, etc.
So I played the new Raw version, the ridiculous production, a few times. I think a handful of times already, and it's a massive improvement to the old version, right? And I'm not even talking about the old version where everybody just collects shits and puts them in front of him, right? But even the laminated player aid, everybody prints on BGG, right, and puts the stuff on it. The physical layout of the tiles, right? The fact that they're laid out the same by all players, the division between temporary tiles and permanent tiles, right? And just the big chunky components, right? Which of course are a ridiculous overproduction, but they are functional in the way that they're very readable from across the table.
In conclusion, Reinhard Nietzsche had a great designer, but he also needs great publishers to make his game shine.
Yes,
I think it goes back to what you said about accessibility, though, because there's a lot of different aspects to it. Like you mentioned setting and things like that, but there's also graphic design. Like that is a part of how accessible a game is.
I mean, I'm still amazed that after the explosion of video gaming over the last 30 years, board games are still starting to catch up in terms of proper UI.
Yeah, and I think a great example for that, going back to the Raw example, right, which was an Ian O'Toole redesign of a Reiner Knizia game. I think the biggest difference between playability there is, I think, Stephenson's Rocket, which that original version, I've played that years ago. It is amazing how opaque that game is with that version. And it's still an opaque game if you play the new version, right? But what they basically did is they moved components to the shared space. So just trackable information, they've just put it in matrices where you can basically put cubes into and people can track where people are. And for example, shares are just a track, points are just a point track instead of money, which is a ridiculous thing. And the tokens aren't on the cities in the center anymore, right? They're just also, as I said, in the matrix. And that makes it such a more readable game, which is super important for that game because that game's strategies are opaque to begin with, right? And then just putting an opaque UI on top of it is just madness.
In conclusion, again, pay your UI designers or whatever you call them, graphical designers, and hire people. I would say hire technical writers for manuals or something along that job. I know technical writers get a lot of bad rap because they're used to writing very dry stuff, but they have the skill set. If you think like you just need a monkey with a typewriter to write a rule book, no. Please go back, read the OG rule book. For all that says their rules are nice.
I think this is going to be one of the challenges in the coming years because I think people will reach for this idea that AI is going to help them write a better rule book by riffing off of existing information. And I think that is going to be a trap because I think there is a real skill to it and a human flair that will bring out the most clear way to communicate something. In exactly the same way I've said, I'd much rather learn a game at a table from someone who knows it well and have that human experience in learning the game and connect with them. A rulebook obviously can't do all of that, but a well-written rulebook can do some of the work, and at least you appreciate, oh, this has been written by a human who's thought about how to communicate this to me. Obviously, I worry the AI stuff that's being experimented at the moment is very, regurgitating existing information, going with what's the most likely word to follow this one. That's really setting a very low bar for how we can communicate information.
Absolutely, it's like predictive plus a lot of layers of diplomacy so we don't get prosecuted. So the only actual surefire use is for people who have not a lot of diplomacy to just fed them your email and say, revive me that in a polite way so that I don't piss off my colleague slash boss slash subcontractor.
Yeah, I think there are probably great uses for the technology, but I think it'll start to be applied to everything, and someone will try and write a game rulebook with it, and I don't think that will be in the sort of top use cases of it. And again, it will be used to say, oh, we do this cheaply, we'll just throw it into this algorithm and get a rulebook. But as you just said, Nicholas, there's no substitute for getting the right person to write that rulebook, which may be an expense when you're producing your game, but will pay dividends in the experience for everyone who plays it.
Yeah, I think it won't replace the human technical writing skill you were just mentioning, right? But it will speed up the people who already have that skill to more productively write a rulebook.
Yeah, that's true. So you still need someone who's got the skills to have a look at what comes out of it. Yeah.
Rotation of the start player again. Now it's me, then Andy, then Dennis.
Okay.
My final, in no particular order, things I liked about OG games is I just get more out of my games. For me, there are roughly two categories of games, and I have a very hard time finding a middle ground between them. The first category is games that are lifestyle hobbies in themselves. That's how I tend to pursue online multiplayer video games, which is very easy because any game there that is quotation marks alive means that you can find a game and be match made with someone roughly at your skill level or not at your skill level and at any hour of the day of the night worldwide. Very easy. I can play the game whenever I want. And that allows me to play more complicated games than I would. In analog form, however, if I want to play Diplomacy or Dune or whatnot, that's a once in a blue moon. Yeah. And what happens with OG is I just get more out of my games because these are the same games that I play with my family, with my friends, with the dorks, and with everyone. And I know that we've insisted a lot on the fact that OG games are very family-friendly games and whatnot, but they are not dumb games. And a notion that I tend to disagree with is, but game X has more depth. I understand partly the argument, but it comes sometimes with the notion that the depth of simpler games has been exhausted, which is not my experience. About any game that is not completely inane will be abandoned long before it's solved.
Yeah.
And I understand the appeal of some more complicated rules when it comes with an upside that could not be simulated by simpler rules. I completely get that. But if I go with the simplest, cleanest, purest form of something, I can experience that. And if I want to experience it more often, I need to be able to play it with as many people as I can. And I really like that I can play, let's say, For Sale with sharks and playing it with newbies and have about the same experience. Sure, I'll let you finish my sentence.
No, sure.
Does anyone want to jump in?
You've set a real challenge for the editor of this podcast. That last sentence ended.
Yeah, the editor for this podcast is screwed. Now, what's interesting there as well is I think in modern board game design, right, and the more baroque game design trends that are currently popular, right, is that it's often said that they're very deep, right? And I think I've posted this on the guild once before, right? What I see happening on the table is that often breadth of choices is confused with depth. Those two are not the same thing, right? The fact that you can do 2 actions on a turn versus 12 actions on a turn doesn't mean that the game with the 12 different actions is deeper, right? I think that's a logical fallacy there where a lot of people fall for. And especially with the more road modern Euro design where it's just picking between these 12 options, which all give you between 1.2 and 2.6 VP per action, right? That's not depth. I mean, that's a lot of choice. And I mean, if you like a lot of choice, that's fine, right? But that's not the same thing as depth.
Yeah, it's not that they lack depth necessarily, but it's people are misdiagnosing where the depth might come from.
Yeah.
Because the depth would probably come, I imagine, from repeated play. And that's how you would really get into, well, what is the best way to approach this situation I might see early in the game if I draw these 3 cards? And I think the thing is, for me, that really echoes what you're saying, Nicholas, is a game could have unlimited depth. It could be Go, which, as far as my lifetime is concerned, might as well have unlimited depth, because I don't think I'm going to go and explore it all. But if I I never go and see it, then I almost don't need it. So maybe a super complicated Eurogame is very broad, as Dennis has just described, and it might be really deep. But if we're never going to play it enough and with enough different groups, like you say, Nicholas, to actually experience that, then do we need the depth and all the complexity? I don't know if we do. And I think that's a trap of sort of the cult of the new. Oh, this game's really deep. I've played it 4 times.
Yeah.
Do we know? We don't know. It might be the deepest game in the world, but we can't possibly know.
My experience with that is that people want the feeling of depth. They want the idea that I'm playing a clever game here. And I figured something out, and there's something going out, and I have experienced looking inside the abyss. And what I've seen from the surface looks super cool, which will not happen on your first game of Go if you don't have a culture of the game beforehand. Of course, everyone knows that Go and chess and an amount of very popular combinatorials are massive. But if you were someone who have never played games and played your first game of Go, you were like, what the hell is it? This is dumb. I'm never playing that again. It's complete garbage.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And Go is another great example of like rules to depth ratio, right?
Yeah, Go is a weird example, right? I think of it as a weird example because it's a game that is super simple rule, but the onboarding process is absolutely terrifying because nobody has any idea what they're doing.
Yeah.
And also, your set rules are easy, right? Oh yeah, it's only 4 sentences. Okay, explain to me how scoring works in 4 sentences. How do you define a group of stones that counts for your scoring? Please do. You have 4 sentences. Let's go. No, they tend to skip that because it's not as
But it doesn't have a 20-page rule book like a modern Euro.
absolutely.
But maybe a lot of games do have similar depth, but if we're not going to explore it, then all the things we've had to put into the game, like the 20 pages of rules, in order to potentially deliver that depth, did we need to put them in if we're not going to go there?
Yeah, but what I understand by depth is the combinatorial of vaguely viable moves there are in a game, right? On a given turn. And in a modern Euro that is overbalanced so that most things are not game losing, then you always have an amount of moves that are about viable-ish, even if not optimal.
Yeah.
Where in a game that is a bit more harsh, and that's not necessarily a characteristic of OGs in itself, but maybe a reflection on how overbalancing is maybe a good idea if you want your game to look smart, because a smart designer perfectly balanced the stuff for us, or the developers at least.
Tell that to the Splotter guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, actually. I haven't ever really thought about, what do people actually mean by depth. I tend to think of it as like, oh, it's a game you would really want to explore and get to know.
Right.
And maybe, therefore, I'm confused and I should rather be thinking about replayability. But again, I think that's the thing that people are very bad at judging.
If they don't play the game more than 5 times, they are indeed bad at judging that, but...
I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because once you get to a certain point with the game, like Zivan, it's like the rules will be gone, won't they? But, once you've played it 5 times, you're barely thinking about the rules at all. It'd be all about the negotiation space with other players. Now, I really like that because for me, that's when you're playing the game. That reminds me of the first games I played, which was traditional card games with my grandparents. Once everyone at the table knows the rules, then it's about the competition. Like, who's winning? Is my grandma winning this time? Is my who's doing what in the game? And that's where, for me, it really comes alive. And that's why I mentioned before about experiencing people's personality. So it's an expression of this social experience that we're having together. And I think you could get confused about what you're looking for in a game. And is the number of combinations of moves I could do right now, like Dennis says, the breadth of options I've got at the moment, is that the same thing as having the best possible experience with a game? For me, it isn't quite.
Beep, 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 beep. So this is actually present, Nicholas. I'm not editing afterwards. I just want to disclaim live that it sounds like, from what Andy just says, that he's a fan of Arc Nova. This is not the case.
Why did you think that said that?
There's a sentence that you said that sounds like, the thing I like about Arc Nova is that once you've played 5 games, you're fine. The rules disappear and you can see the interaction.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, you could say that about any game, I guess. You could get to that point. Again, when we talked about accessibility, what I like with an OG is I feel you'll get to that point faster. And like you said, introducing this point, Nicholas, I think is the idea that you could play it with more different groups of people and you could really experience the game in different ways as well. Like, I've I've played Chicago Express with people who probably wouldn't identify as gamers, but they're all like, oh, that's really interesting. It's starting to think afterwards, like, what's the implication of when you put that up for auction? And I think when the game's got a relatively easy framework to onboard people, then they get that wow moment of like, oh god, this is what board games can offer. I'm not playing Sorry or Monopoly, although I think Monopoly is a bit more maligned because people don't like the negotiation element, which is basically the whole game. But we're not playing Snakes and Ladders, and for me, that's the joy that OGs can bring. Like you say, Nicholas, you can take this to a wide audience because they've got these properties.
I just love that moment when you play Chicago Express with new people for the first time, right? And you say, okay, I'm going to do the auction action, and I'm going to auction nothing. And they're like,
nothing, yes.
What? You can do this?
So my final item is playtime. When I think of OGs, I think of your traditional length of old school game close to an hour and a half. Whereas I think obviously we've seen games in more recent times, the most popular games have tended to become longer. I prefer the shorter game, the 1 hour, 1.5 hours, for a lot of the reasons we already mentioned. Nicholas, it's a much easier proposition to present this to a new group of people. If you say, we're going to play this game for an hour, then we're going to play it for 3 hours after I've spent 40 minutes teaching you the rules. I also just think it's better for my own energy levels. It's easier to say, oh, we've played one game, are we playing another one? Or, is that the end of our session? It allows you to do what I know Martin calls tapas gaming, where if you've got a 4-hour session, instead of playing one game, you can play 4 1-hour games, or even 8 half-an-hour games, and then come out of a games day or a convention or something with a massive list of games you've played, or playing a game and immediately saying, let's play that again, if we all found it interesting, which I think is something that I really noticed sort of went out of public game groups that I went to, but understandably, because if the game takes 2.5, 3 hours, if we're meeting in an evening after work, probably haven't got the time to play it twice. So I think this is a really great thing. I've talked a lot about modern games there, but I think it's just a great thing about the old school games and games that are still designed in that tradition, is that this playtime adds and supports a lot of these properties that we've talked about.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? There's a time and a place for big games as well, right? And there can be something epic about a really big game. But the thing I think which is a shame is that the 60 to 90 minutes is just such a great default game length for a bigger game, right? Of course, there's smaller card games and smaller games as well and shorter games as well. They all have a place. But that time frame, like as a default time spent, would be great. And then you can make games that are longer, make games that are shorter. But nowadays, it's just trending longer and longer and longer, right?
Yeah, I'm famous with some of my friends that I always moan about how films are now 3 hours long instead of 2 hours. And I think it's a similar thing where I just feel the old length was perfect. And why have we gone on a trend where we've gone to this other place? So I think you're right, Dennis. You can have an experience game. I've played like Here I Stand, like I mentioned earlier, where, a huge war game for 6 players. We all have to do loads of preparation. It takes absolutely ages to set up with all these counters everywhere. And then we're playing it literally all day. That is an experience. And I wouldn't want to say every game has to be 60 to 90 minutes. But I think
I thought you were going to say every game doesn't have to be Here I Stand. I was like, okay.
Although, yeah, that's definitely true. Now, my Grail game, don't get me wrong, would be like an OG version of Virgin Queen, which played in like 2 hours. And I think that, that's the sort of thing I sometimes think that I haven't got the chops to design that, but I'd love it if someone did.
Yeah, same here.
But, I think you're right. As a default length, I think the hour to 90 minutes, which I think is much closer to where things were in the 90s, early 2000s, is a better place for me to be than 3 hours. It just gives you more flexibility. If you have got the 3 hour session, you can play twice, or twice at a little short card game as well.
I'm wondering to which extent this is a function of our age, right? The question I'm asking myself sometimes is, okay, so we're sort of the old guard of BGG or the middle guard, I don't know. To which extent is the hobby catering to a new generation that is longer and just has more free time, that people in their whatever teas having a lot more responsibility and not being able to free 3 hours on a whim? I remember when I started playing the hobby, I was more into epic games just because I was like a student and could just say, hey, come here, we're going to play big Fantasy Flight monster thing. We're going to play a 1 hour 30 filler beforehand, and then at midnight we start the 6 hour session of Arkham Horror 2nd Edition or whatnot.
I understand your point, but I feel like my length of game session hasn't changed that much over the last sort of 10 years. but my preference for how many games I play in that site has changed. So.
Andy still has the stamina, is what he's saying, Nicholas.
Well, not always, but I think another thing is it gives
No,
you
not always,
It gives you the It gives you the flexibility, doesn't it? To let's call it a night there, or let's play another game, or for people to join late, or leave early, which it can be a factor in different board game group situations.
Yeah, it's not the length that counts; it's the flexibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've reached our low now, guys. Apologies.
This is staying in.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so my final item is a very sappy, emotional one, guys, after that dirty talk. I think the OG Guild is one of the best features of OG games.
Oh.
No, but looking at BoardGameGeek, right? So there are lots of guilds and there are lots of places to discuss stuff and to play with people, right? But the sense of community I get from the OG Guild, and I haven't been that active on the forums, right? But I hope we are able to keep it, right? Because the guild has been growing a lot. There's a kind of intimacy, I think, in the guild and a kind of camaraderie in the guild, which I really appreciate. And it really feels like a home on BoardGameGeek, right? And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I definitely find it's the best part of BoardGameGeek. It's got a very different vibe to the general forums. I know I'm one of the people who tends to express myself negatively about some modern Euros. And even when we've been talking here today, I'm conscious I'm doing it a bit, saying, oh, the trend's gone in this direction and I don't like it.
Yeah.
I should word it more that I'm trying to celebrate how things were.
Yeah.
I'd like to see more games done in that style, but I think it's a really cool community around it. As you say, I hope it remains like you said.
It's not necessarily how things were. What we're trying to say about that is that OGs used to be the key player in the market, and now if you want to find games, there are more games on the market and probably as many OGs, but in proportion they're lower, and finding them is a bit harder because nobody puts a spotlight on them.
That's true, and that's the thing I really like about the guild actually, is because I've basically got to the point where I'm not really paying that much attention to new releases, so it's really cool that people will highlight, oh, this is coming out, and it's got some of the design sensibilities that people in our group will like. So.
I think we're doing a great job at promoting Zuvardis, for instance, which I don't know if it would have released with as much pizzazz otherwise. It has not released yet.
It's funded on Kickstarter.
Yeah, maybe I'm tooting our own horn a bit, but at least I wouldn't have heard of the game otherwise, which I like. I like the guild a lot as a discoverability outlet. I like it even more discussion space, as you said. And I'm pretty sure that when I decided on this podcast topic, I went in my shower the next day and I had this as an item. And then by the time I wrote my items down, I had forgotten. And I'm very frustrated because I'm like, the best part is obviously like, hello, I'm Nicolas Weiss. My hobby is not board gaming, it's actually discussing games with the guilds these days, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
It's actually
That's
discussing
true.
with old men on the internet.
I mean, I think the thing is, like you said, Nicholas, although OGs are easier to introduce to more groups of people, if you're a big hobbyist of it, chances are most people you know in your life are not as into board games as you are.
Yep.
So to have an online discussion place as well with other enthusiasts is really cool. And similarly, the way we've been able to play some of the games online, I think is great, because I've played games there, like Marrakesh, for example. I don't know anyone with a copy. I don't really know any groups locally that would be inclined to play it. So the OG Guild has not only allowed me to hear about this game, and like, have you heard about this one? It was really only ever printed in one edition, and you might not have heard of it, but also allowed me to actually experience playing it, which has been great.
Yeah, so this is our chance to plug the OG Fest, right? And give Nicholas 10 hours to edit this podcast.
Absolutely. I was about to finish the podcast on that note. People, if you want to join the OG Fest, it's too late. Even if I was to publish that now, you would not have finished listening to it before we start the fest, and it will last 2 days. So, after this podcast, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bed, I'm going to get less than 8 hours of sleep, and then I'm going to start the first official event of the OG Fest on midnight, United States East Coast, Saturday 20th of May, something like that, and then 2 entire days, 48 hours continuous board gaming amongst all the people that will be there on the server, which I assume will be less than the amount of subscribed. And if at 9 o'clock I'm the only person awake, I will be not surprised whatsoever.
Yeah, so it started in 7 hours and 3 minutes, so.
Yeah, we play a lot of, OG games online and card games organised in a very ad hoc fashion. This is the bigger event.
Yeah.
We did one previously back in November. of 2022. This one is happening this weekend in May 2023. I'm sure there will be another one in the future, assuming that this one is a success like the previous one was.
Beep, 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 beep. Distant future Nicolas here. Well, guess what? Andy was right. That's why I left the whole advertisement in. We're having a new OG Fest. It's in a week, this October. I think it's called OG Autumn Fest or something. Real missed opportunity here. We should have called it OG Toberfest. Toberfest. It's a ban. Anyway, if everything you heard so far sounds interesting, we're sure having one of those again. It's a 48-hour marathon. The weekend of October 20th. Every podcast host that you've heard so far will be present. So if you want to come play games with us, you know what to do. Please join the Discord for more information. Future Nicolas out. Beep, 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 beep.
Yeah, Mark, who's been organizing these, has planned to make about 2 a year. The only problem with OG Springfest is, of course, that we ignore that the Southern Hemisphere exists, as usual, because time zones are horrible. But come on the Discord server, time zones are slightly less horrible, because when you go there, suddenly you enter the event, you enter the date, and it translates it to everyone else's local hour and whatnot.
Yeah, and there are event hosts in different time zones, so
Yep.
you'll have the opportunity to play pretty much whenever you're available during the weekend.
Yeah,
Which is great. So
essentially I sleep and I wake up just to humor the Australians, because nobody wants to wake up on a Saturday morning to play board games. What insane kind of human being does that?
I would like to do that.
Well, please be awake tomorrow morning then.
Yes, I will try.
You will try. Okay, so after this massive genius idea of Nicolas, we're trying to make a shorter podcast by making the topic of the day. Please come with 9 different topics for conversation. We're going to...
Keep it short, he said.
Keep it short, he said. We're just going to have 9 topics of the day. Genius. We're going to move on to the segment that...
Hi! So we had recorded another segment. It was not very good. So I eventually cut it out the edit. Everyone who's always dreamt of listening to a shorter episode, you can thank me. I just gave you 30 minutes. Now you might think I'm just being lazy here. Do you know how hard it is to edit our rumblings? Okay, here's what I will do. You will now get an entire 3 minutes of unedited footage. And then maybe you realize why I spend time editing this shit.
Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for joining me today. This is the part where I thank my co-host for having co-hosted with me, and then they can chill for their socials and whatnot. With me today have been Andy Pymont. Who are you?
yeah, thanks for having it.
Who are you, and what are you doing on the internet? Or else?
He
Yes.
doesn't want to disclose
Thanks
that.
very
Nicholas, no worries.
Yes, thanks for having me, Nicholas. People can find me on BoardGameGeek, where I'm Normandy Wept. That is an anagram of my name. I'll look forward to seeing you all on there and continuing to chat on the guild. As Dennis mentioned before, it's a great space on BoardGameGeek that I really enjoy. I also run the OG of the month there. So please do come along and check that out. There's a geek list with all the entries, and there's a discussion thread, so please do recommend to me anything you think that we should highlight for other members of the guild. We'll get it featured in future months, but thanks for having me, and nice chatting to you guys.
Also with me today, Dennis Slowman. Who are you, and when do you open your OnlyFans?
What makes you assume I don't already have an
I
OnlyFans?
will redo that.
Which funds all my board game purchases, Nicholas?
Sorry. Also with me
you
today,
do know that feet.
Was that a stereotype about the Dutch? Is that racist?
I have no idea. Is it?
You do know that feet are very popular on OnlyFans, Nicholas. Just pictures of my feet, right? It's just the money keeps rolling in.
Okay, we're definitely removing that part. We're redoing that one. Is it the French who have the stereotype of being promiscuous?
Yes.
Yeah,
but the Dutch,
you all have a wife and a mistress, yes, but the Dutch have the red light districts, don't they? So
It's
I
cool.
assume the Dutch would do anything for money, right? So that's-
Absolutely great.
Yeah.
I only have the mistress. That's the best part. Well, I guess
about
I
your
have
cats
the cat.
again.
I think I have the cat too. That's a problem.
cats, yeah, that's your master.
That's my god.
Yeah.
I am only the rightful knight. Blah, 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 blah. Also with me today, Danny Sloman. Who are you and what are you?
Who are you and what are you doing here?
What are
Who
you
are
doing
you?
here? Just keep this in, Nicholas. Keep this in. This is the
Just what are
perfect.
you doing?
This is the perfect end for the podcast. What I'm doing, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, Nicholas. I'm in this weird OG podcast.
Q-Brutes, what does the name even mean? Q-Brutes, no idea what's smart in Q-Brutes, pressing the ICO.
I don't know to end this
Outro.